The sea was silent until the light found them. At exactly 01:48 a.m., November 13, 1942, the black surface of Iron Bottom Sound fractured beneath the blinding beam of a searchlight. In that single instant, night turned to theater, and the stage was set for the kind of war Japan was never prepared to fight. Captain Tameichi Hara gripped the cold railing of the destroyer Amatsukaze, his knuckles whitening. Across the water, the American heavy cruiser San Francisco opened fire. There was no careful aiming, no elegant choreography of gunnery. There was only volume. Dozens of 5-inch shells arced through the tropical darkness, a red and orange storm erasing the stars. The night itself seemed to ignite. "They're not aiming, they're filling the sea with fire." That's what Hara wrote in his logbook before dawn broke over Guadalcanal. He didn't know it yet, but this single night revealed a truth that would define the entire Pacific War. What he witnessed wasn't just firepower. It was industrial civilization unbound. In 35 seconds, the San Francisco unleashed more shells than some Japanese destroyers carried for entire missions. Their gun barrels glowed red-hot, steel melting into light. The sea boiled where shells struck. For Hara's crew, it was like facing a volcano that had learned to aim. 2,700 miles away on the docks of Pearl Harbor, ammunition ships were already being loaded for the next operation. 15,000 tons of shells, stacked like wheat waiting to be harvested. For the Americans, firepower wasn't precious. It was planned, scheduled, endless. Tokyo's planners, by contrast, were counting shells by the dozen. 12 rounds per gun, that was what they could afford for the next convoy run. 12 rounds against a wall of steel. In that arithmetic lay the shape of the war to come. The battle raged with a brutality that no romantic image of naval warfare could capture. The Americans filled the darkness with lead and steel until the ocean glowed like molten glass. It wasn't precision that overwhelmed the Japanese. It was excess. Hara's ship twisted and turned, dodging tracers that came like rain from an angry sky. Below decks, sailors prayed into the roar of the engines. Above, Hara stared into the blaze. He was a veteran, trained in the meticulous economy of Japanese gunnery, a doctrine built around scarcity, careful aim, and conservation. And here, that entire philosophy cracked apart. His world was built on counting rounds. The enemy's world was built on making sure counting didn't matter. American logistics had already bent the Pacific into an assembly line. Ammunition left factories in Nebraska, Iowa, New Jersey, was packed onto trains, shipped to Pearl Harbor, then to the decks of ships like San Francisco. By the time Hara faced that burning wall of ordnance, the next wave of shells was already on its way across the Pacific. For every Japanese round fired that night, the Americans had 10 more waiting on a dock. It was an advantage so vast that it didn't need to be hidden or even strategized. It simply existed, like gravity. Hara's officers whispered on the bridge as their ship shuddered from near misses. Their own magazines held enough ammunition for a short engagement, a handful of minutes of full fire. Every round they spent was a decision. Every decision could mean survival or silence. For the Americans, there were no such calculations. The battle was less a duel and more an industrial performance. Shells were not measured like treasure, they were burned like fuel. Hara's gunners fired back with the discipline they'd drilled for years, aiming carefully at silhouettes that barely flinched beneath the onslaught. Their tracers vanished into the storm. It was like trying to carve a river with a needle. A shell struck near the forward deck, showering the bridge with splinters and smoke. A petty officer screamed something about ammunition storage. Hara didn't hear the words, only the wind, and the dull certainty in his chest. This was a different kind of war than the one Japan had imagined. Back in Tokyo, the Imperial Navy had believed its training, its skill, and its courage could balance the scales against the United States. They built their strategy on decisive engagements, sharp, clean blows, not wars of attrition. No one in that planning room imagined a night like this. An enemy that treated ammunition not as a resource, but as a language. Every shell fired from those American ships was a message, one written not by admirals, but by factory workers thousands of miles away. Men and women in dusty overalls on assembly lines had decided this battle long before Hara even took the bridge. The clock ticked past 2:00 a.m. The sky pulsed with explosions. Fire turned the night to a second sunrise. The Amatsukaze limped through curtains of flame as Hara steadied his voice. "We will fight with what we have," he told his officers, "and when it's gone, we will fight with nothing." He meant it, but somewhere deep inside, the veteran officer understood the bitter truth. The Americans could fight again tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that. When the shooting finally died down, and the last echo of guns faded into the steaming sea, Hara stood alone on the bridge. The acrid smell of cordite filled his lungs. The horizon burned, and behind that fire, though invisible, he could feel the weight of 1,000 factories, silent giants, moving in perfect rhythm. The Pacific War would be fought with ships and planes, yes, but its outcome was being written in steel presses, conveyor belts, and freight trains. Tonight was just the opening act. The war didn't collapse in a single night. It began with small fractures, hairline cracks in an empire's confidence. And for Japan's navy, those cracks first appeared months before Guadalcanal, far out on the waters of the Coral Sea. May 7, 1942. Commander Taishi Naito, executive officer aboard the carrier Shikaku, leaned over the railing and watched American cruisers and destroyers through field glasses. What puzzled him wasn't their formation or speed. It was the endless flicker of light around them. Their anti-aircraft guns roared hour after hour, a mechanical rhythm that never faltered. Their tracers lit the sky like a forge with no end. 4 hours, he wrote later. They fired for 4 hours without pause. It was not a battle, it was a factory. Japanese doctrine treated ammunition like gold dust. For years, naval officers drilled their crews to fire short, precise bursts. 800 meters, that was the engagement rule. Anything outside that range was a waste they couldn't afford. American gunners had no such limits. Their ships spat fire into the sky as if the magazines were bottomless. Lieutenant Commander Masatake Okumiya, aboard Ryujo, had trained his men to fight on a stopwatch. 12 minutes. That was how long their magazines could sustain full anti-aircraft fire before falling silent. He knew it with the certainty of a man who had counted every round himself. 12 minutes against an enemy who could fight all night. When the air attacks finally ended, Naito stared at the empty sky with a strange sensation in his chest. It wasn't fear, not yet. It was the first flicker of realization. This enemy wasn't fighting on the same scale. They were fighting in another dimension entirely. 3 months earlier, the Battle of the Java Sea had seemed a clean Japanese victory. Allied ships under Rear Admiral Carol Dorman fired more than 1,600 8-inch shells, landing only a handful of hits. The Imperial Navy fired far fewer rounds, and won decisively. It looked like proof that superior training and precision could overcome quantity. But on the bridge of Amatsukaze, Captain Hara noticed something his after-action report didn't dare say aloud. The Allied ships had never stopped firing. Not once. Hour after hour, their turrets had roared like an endless drumbeat, burning through ammunition as though it were smoke. After the battle, Lieutenant Yoshida, Hara's gunnery officer, quietly did the math. "Captain, we've used 40% of our main battery ammunition in one engagement. If the fight had lasted 2 more hours." Hara silenced him with a look, but he felt the same cold calculation. Their destroyer had sailed with 2,000 rounds. They'd spent 800 in one night. One Allied cruiser they engaged had fired over 1,500 8-inch shells, more than an entire Japanese heavy cruiser carried in total. For Tokyo's admirals, these were tactical details. For the officers on deck, it was something else entirely, a warning. Precision was an art, but quantity was gravity, and gravity always wins. The Americans didn't care about conserving ammunition because they didn't need to. Behind every shell fired at Java or Coral Sea was a production system, so vast the men on the water could scarcely imagine it. The Japanese counted every round like a prayer. The Americans simply reloaded. And yet, in the spring of 1942, few in the Imperial Navy understood the shape of the storm building across the ocean. Japan's war plan was built on decisive blows, surprise, superior seamanship, and iron discipline. They believed America wouldn't have the will to sustain a long war. But America wasn't building a short war. It was building an assembly line. As Coral Sea faded into the war's chronology, the logbooks recorded victory or loss in ship movements and flight numbers. But beneath those entries was something more important, the widening gap between two visions of war. One measured its strength in rounds remaining, the other in rounds to come. Hara, NATO, Okumiya, none of them could have described the full scale of it then, but they felt it. It was in the glow of American gun barrels, in the endless thud of shells, in the silence after their own guns ran dry. The empire they served believed skill could overcome industry. That belief had just taken its first hit. By the time the Coral Sea and Java Sea battles ended, the cracks were there. Small, subtle, easy to ignore in Tokyo's victory bulletins, but cracks have a way of widening when pressure mounts. And across the Pacific, pressure was already building at a speed no doctrine could stop. The first cracks in Japan's naval confidence widened into chasms at Guadalcanal. When the Americans landed on the island on August 7, 1942, the Imperial Navy prepared to strike back with speed and precision. What they didn't fully grasp was that the battle would no longer be decided by precision, but by production. Vice Admiral Junichi Mikawa led his striking force south from Rabaul under the cover of darkness. His ships carried enough ammunition for exactly one night of fighting. That was not a tactical choice. It was all that existed in the Rabaul magazines. The supply lines behind him were thin, stretched, and fragile. At Savo Island, Mikawa's force achieved a near-perfect ambush. In just 33 minutes, Japanese cruisers tore into the Allied formation, sinking 4 heavy cruisers and killing over 1,000 sailors. It was the kind of surgical strike their doctrine was built for: fast, lethal, efficient. But hidden inside this triumph was a catastrophe. Commander Toshikazu Omi, Mikawa's operations officer, admitted after the war, "We withdrew not because of the air threat, as you believed, but because we had almost no ammunition left. A second engagement was impossible." The transports that had brought American troops to Guadalcanal lay in the water, practically defenseless. And yet the Japanese could not fire. Their guns were silent not because of defeat, but because they had nothing left to shoot. While the Imperial Navy counted its shells, the Americans were already unloading replacements in Pearl Harbor. In a single shipment, ammunition ship USS Rainier carried 5,000 tons of shells, more than Japan could supply to Guadalcanal in months. One voyage, one ship, enough to erase an entire campaign's worth of Japanese firepower. On the island itself, the contrast grew crueler by the day. Tokyo Express, the fast destroyer runs intended to keep Japanese forces supplied, carried more rice and medicine than ammunition. On November 30th, Rear Admiral Reizo Tanaka led 8 destroyers south. Captured documents revealed the grim math. Rice, 1,100 drums. Medical supplies, 200 drums. Ammunition, 280 drums. For 15,000 Japanese soldiers, those 280 drums represented their ability to fight and to survive. Each drum held roughly 300 rifle rounds or their equivalent in shells. That meant the entire garrison was living on ammunition reserves that a single American destroyer could burn through in 20 minutes of combat. Hara, still commanding Amatsukaze, wrote bitterly in his journal, "We risk 8 destroyers, dozens of lives, tons of fuel, to deliver what the Americans probably waste in target practice." He wasn't wrong. That same day, destroyer USS Fletcher conducted a routine gunnery exercise, firing 127 rounds of 5-inch ammunition for training. Half a drum, half of what Tanaka's men had died to deliver. For the men on Guadalcanal, scarcity became a way of life. Ammunition was rationed like blood. Patrols went out with barely enough rounds for a single firefight. Machine guns were used only in ambushes. Mortars fired once, then fell silent. The jungle became a place where silence itself was a weapon. For the Americans, ammunition was not just plentiful, it was built into their entire operational rhythm. Service squadrons flowed across the Pacific like arteries, carrying replacement shells, fuel, and spare parts with relentless efficiency. A battle didn't deplete their strength, it triggered a shipment. Mikawa's brilliant tactics and Hara's discipline couldn't alter this simple truth. The arsenal behind the fleet decides how long a navy can fight, and Japan's arsenal was a candle against a floodlight. The longer the campaign dragged on, the clearer this became. Japanese destroyers raced down the slot night after night, risking aircraft and submarines, to deliver what the U.S. Navy considered a fraction of its daily consumption. American forces at Henderson Field could expend more ammunition in a day of fighting than the entire Tokyo Express could deliver in a week. Tokyo's high command clung to hope that superior fighting spirit would make up for shortages. But the Pacific did not reward hope. It rewarded logistics. As the rains turned the island to mud and disease tore through exhausted soldiers, Japan's commanders discovered that courage doesn't reload magazines. Factories do. By the time winter crept over Guadalcanal, the Japanese were still fighting. They were still deadly, still disciplined, still capable of ambush and shock. But the Americans were fighting with a river behind them, and the Japanese were fighting with a bucket. The arsenal had awakened, not in Tokyo but in America, and its rhythm would drown everything in its path. While the front lines burned, the war's outcome was being forged thousands of miles away, not at sea, but in factories. In the heart of the American Midwest, in towns most soldiers had never heard of, the United States Navy was quietly building a weapon Japan could never match: unlimited ammunition. March 1943. The Naval Ammunition Depot Hastings in Nebraska opened its gates to a workforce of 10,000. 48,000 acres of prairie were transformed into a living machine, 2,200 buildings, 207 miles of railway track, endless conveyor belts, and storage bunkers stretching to the horizon. This single facility would produce nearly 40% of the U.S. Navy's ammunition during the war. In its first month, Hastings produced more naval ammunition than all of Japan's facilities combined would manufacture for the rest of 1943. The numbers were staggering: 100,000 rounds of 5-inch ammunition per month, rising to 300,000 by the end of the year. Every round was inspected, tested, and packaged with a precision that reflected not scarcity but abundance. Quality control rejected more ammunition than Japanese arsenals produced in total. American naval power wasn't just built at sea. It was built on assembly lines running 24 hours a day. Meanwhile, in Japan, the situation was almost inverted. Kure Naval Arsenal, the nation's premier ammunition facility, struggled to produce 10,000 shells of all calibers monthly. Toyokawa Arsenal, expanded at great cost, managed more only by employing 56,000 workers, including 6,000 schoolchildren between 12 and 16 years old. They worked under dangerous conditions, often hungry, often exhausted. 12-year-old Akiko Sato remembered it vividly in her memoir. We worked until we fell down. They gave us one rice ball for lunch. We made 100 shells a day in our section. The Americans probably fired that many in a second. This was the cruel mathematics of war, where American workers assembled shells in clean, modern facilities with cafeterias and daycares. Japanese children filled casings in bomb-prone factories. As the war stretched into 1944, the gap widened into an abyss. Ammunition Depot McAllister in Oklahoma specialized in large-caliber shells and aerial bombs. By December, it was shipping more than 500,000 pounds of ordnance each month. Another facility in Indiana stored 400,000 tons of ammunition, double Japan's entire pre-war naval reserve. Behind every American gun crew stood a machine so vast that individual shells ceased to matter. A 5-inch round was a product of steel mills, railroads, river barges, dock cranes, and human hands working in perfect rhythm. The factory floor in Nebraska had more strategic weight than any single warship. In Japan, that rhythm simply didn't exist. Every shell was an effort, a cost, a risk. Ammunition had to be hoarded, not spent. War planners argued over whether convoys could spare 12 shells per gun. Children melted copper wiring to salvage enough metal to cast new casings. The American system allowed its gunners to fight recklessly because recklessness could be resupplied. The Japanese system forced its gunners to fight carefully because careful was the only option. When Admiral Raymond Spruance's task force crossed the Pacific, its logistics train followed like a moving continent: oilers, ammunition ships, tugs, and floating depots. A single replenishment convoy could deliver more ammunition than Japan produced in months. Japan, meanwhile, was trying to fight a modern industrial war with an economy already strained by years of expansion, blockade, and shortage. The difference wasn't just in output, it was in psychology. American gunners trained with live ammunition freely, learning through constant repetition. Japanese gunners fired sparingly, knowing that every practice shot meant one fewer for a real battle. This industrial divide shaped the very doctrine of both navies. American strategy assumed ammunition would always be there. Japanese strategy assumed it would run out. Every shell forged in Hastings, McAllister, or Crane didn't just feed the war machine. It rewrote the tempo of the Pacific. In the Pacific skies and seas, Japanese officers like Hara would face the consequences of that production gap in every battle. But the war itself was already being decided on the quiet factory floors of Middle America, where steam whistles marked shift changes and freight trains rolled out carrying the fate of the Pacific. By mid-1944, the war had shifted irreversibly. The quiet arithmetic of factories now roared across the Pacific as gunfire. At sea, the Americans no longer fought battles to survive. They fought with the momentum of a nation that could not run out of ammunition. The Japanese, still disciplined, still deadly, now faced storms instead of duels. June 19, 1944. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa gathered the last powerful carrier force of the Imperial Navy. 9 carriers, 473 aircraft. It was meant to be the decisive battle, the strike that would bleed the Americans dry. But across the ocean, Admiral Raymond Spruance commanded 15 carriers, nearly 1,000 aircraft, and something Ozawa couldn't see: a logistics tale measured in mountains of shells and bullets. When Ozawa's planes approached the American fleet, the sky turned into a solid wall of explosions. Lieutenant Sadamu Takahashi, flying a Zero from Teiho, described it later. The air itself burned. It wasn't aimed fire, it was everywhere. There was no gap to fly through. Every 5-inch gun in the task force fired 15 rounds per minute. Every 40 mount spat out 120 rounds per minute. The 20 guns fired faster still. One destroyer, USS Stockham, alone unleashed 12.0 rounds of 40 and 20,000 rounds of 20 in 6 hours of combat. The Japanese pilots called it a wall of fire. American officers simply called it standard procedure. When the smoke cleared, Japan had lost 476 aircraft. The U.S. had lost 29. It wasn't just pilot skill. It was the volume of fire, the math of steel in the air. The Americans expended over 200,000 rounds of 5-inch ammunition in that single engagement. For the Imperial Navy, that was the equivalent of several months' worth of national production. One Japanese pilot, pulled from the sea days later, summed it up with bitter clarity. It wasn't a battle, it was execution by machinery. 4 months later, off Samar Island in the Philippines, the storm came again. This time, the Japanese sent her force under Admiral Takeo Kurita, 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, 11 destroyers achieved total tactical surprise against a tiny American escort group. 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, 4 destroyer escorts. The Americans should have been swept aside, but their destroyers carried a weapon more devastating than their size suggested: endless ammunition. Commander Ernest Evans aboard USS Johnston gave the order without hesitation. All hands to general quarters, prepare to attack major fleet units. Johnston lunged toward the Japanese battle line like a wolf against a bear. In the next hour, her guns fired over 200 rounds, smashing Kumano's superstructure. She then turned her guns on Congo, firing another 30 rounds while making smoke. Her gunners didn't count. They fired. On destroyer escort USS Samuel B. Roberts, Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland rallied his men with brutal honesty. This will be a fight against overwhelming odds, from which survival cannot be expected. His ship carried 325 rounds per gun. In 35 minutes, Roberts fired nearly 40% of her total magazine. Gun barrels glowed white. Gun crews loaded shells by hand when power failed. Gunner's mate third-class Paul H. Carr, mortally wounded, died still clutching one last shell, trying to load it. Across the ocean, the Yamato, the largest battleship ever built, opened fire for the first time against surface targets. Her massive 18.1-inch shells, engineered for battleship duels, ripped through thin-skinned escort carriers but often failed to explode. Ammunition meant for one kind of war met a different kind of enemy. Admiral Matom Ugaki wrote in his diary that night, "The enemy destroyers charged through their own smoke, firing continuously. Such expenditure of ammunition for such small ships, it defies calculation." By the end of the battle, U.S. forces had fired 20,000 rounds of all calibers. Japan, roughly 3,000. The Americans lost 2 destroyers, 1 escort carrier. Japan lost 3 heavy cruisers damaged and withdrew from what should have been a certain victory. It was David and Goliath, but David carried an endless supply of stones. For the Americans, these storms of steel were routine. Behind every engagement was an ammunition train waiting just beyond the horizon. A battle didn't end their ability to fight, it reset the clock. For the Japanese, every large engagement depleted the finite stockpile they could never fully replace. Even when their tactics worked, even when courage burned bright, the math still broke against them. No doctrine, no courage, no brilliance of maneuver could rewrite the production lines of Hastings and McAllister. These factories did not bleed. They did not tire. They simply filled more crates. At Samar and the Philippine Sea, the Imperial Navy collided not with fleets but with the industrial heart of a continent. That was the real opponent. In the spring of 1945, the Yamato, the largest battleship ever built, prepared for her last voyage. She was not sailing toward victory, she was sailing toward history. The ship had been born as the symbol of Japan's naval supremacy. But when she left Tokuyama Harbor on April 6th, she carried just enough fuel for a one-way journey and barely enough ammunition for a single major engagement. The super battleship of legend was reduced to a suicide weapon. Captain Kasaku Ariga stood on the bridge as the gray shoreline faded behind Yamato. He understood what awaited them. The Imperial Navy had no more fleets, no more carrier groups, no more reserves. What remained of Japan's arsenal was loaded aboard Yamato's magazines, a final gesture rather than a strategy. Ariga turned to his gunnery officer. "We will make our last stand with what we have." The numbers were brutally simple. Yamato's 18.1-inch guns carried less than 150 armor-piercing shells. Her secondary and anti-aircraft batteries had enough ammunition for a few hours of sustained fire, not a battle against hundreds of American aircraft. Across the Pacific, the U.S. Fifth Fleet waited with 1,000 carrier-based planes, fueled and armed by a logistics train stretching across the ocean like a steel artery. Ammunition ships stood ready just behind the fleet, able to restock entire task forces overnight. In Japan, the home front was being stripped bare to feed the last guns. Schoolchildren lined up at temples as ancient bronze bells were melted down to recover metal for shell casings. Neighborhood associations collected pots, pans, and wire. The Imperial Navy was trying to feed a war machine with scrap. Akiko Sato, now 15, remembered standing barefoot in the cold outside a foundry. "The bell from our shrine was on a cart. I thought it would come back. It never did." Those bells became fragments of 25 shells, tiny pieces of a desperate attempt to match an enemy that had already surpassed Japan in every industrial measure. By 1945, the United States was producing 25 million rounds of naval ammunition every month. Japan was producing barely a fraction of 1 million. The gap had become cosmic. On April 7th, 386 American aircraft found Yamato off Kyushu. Dive bombers, torpedo planes, fighters, an entire swarm, each loaded with ordnance drawn from those endless depots. Yamato's gunners opened fire with everything they had. Tracers arced upward in glowing sheets. Her crews fought with a discipline forged in years of war. But their magazines began to empty within minutes. Every shell fired was irreplaceable. There would be no reload, no second sortie, no reinforcements. "Keep firing until there is nothing left," Ariga shouted. Above them, American pilots flew with the confidence of men who knew their carriers would simply arm the next wave. The sky itself belonged to industry. Within an hour, Yamato absorbed 10 torpedoes and at least 8 bomb hits. Her ammunition stores exploded, tearing the great ship in half. At 2:23 p.m., she rolled, capsized, and disappeared beneath the waves. Over 3,000 sailors died. She had fired fewer than 100 of her main battery shells. When news reached Tokyo, there was no illusion left. Yamato's death wasn't just the loss of a ship. It was the collapse of an idea, that courage and skill could match an enemy whose factories never slept. In American planning rooms, Yamato was not feared. She was calculated: fuel levels, gun ranges, ammunition counts. Her destruction wasn't just a tactical triumph. It was a proof of concept: output wins wars. That same week, in the Philippines, an American destroyer squadron completed a training exercise, expending more ammunition than Yamato carried in her entire last mission. Japan had entered the war believing the spirit of the warrior could balance the scales. But by 1945, there were no scales left. There was only production. War isn't only fought with guns and shells. It's also fought in the minds of those who pull the trigger. By 1945, the gap between American and Japanese ammunition supply had created two entirely different kinds of navies, not just materially, but psychologically. For American sailors, ammunition was as constant as the ocean. Seaman James Bradley, a gunner aboard USS Laffey, later recalled, "We never thought about running out. The supply ships came every few days with mountains of shells. We joked that we could shoot at seagulls and no one would care. That casual confidence shaped tactics. Destroyers charged battleships. PT boats attacked convoys. Escorts stood their ground against cruisers. The David versus Goliath moments of the Pacific weren't acts of blind heroism. They were acts made possible because David had endless stones to throw. This mentality ran deep in training. At American gunnery schools, recruits fired thousands of live rounds. Those who missed didn't face punishment. They got more ammunition until they improved. Ammunition was a tool for learning, not a treasure to protect. For Japanese sailors, the situation was reversed. Lieutenant Kazuhiko Ono, a gunnery officer on destroyer Isakaze, remembered. Every shot was a calculation. We counted rounds like misers count coins. Before firing, you asked yourself, can I afford this shell? Scarcity bred hesitation. A gunner who might have fired on instinct instead waited for a perfect shot that rarely came. Japanese doctrine enforced strict ammunition conservation. Don't fire until targets are close. Don't waste bursts. Stop when the range is poor. In a modern war defined by speed, that hesitation was fatal. The psychological toll was crushing. Officers wrote in their diaries about the fear of running dry, a phrase that had no American equivalent. Admiral Chester Nimitz, reading decoded Japanese ammunition reports in late 1944, summed up the situation with brutal clarity. They're a boxer with no punch left. We just keep hitting until they fall. U.S. planners deliberately designed operations to drain Japanese magazines, harassment raids, feints, airstrikes, all calculated to force the Imperial Navy to spend ammunition it could not replace. American submarines then intercepted ammunition convoys, sinking over half of all shipments before they reached the front. Commander Yashiro Tanaka, responsible for ammunition logistics in the Philippines, left a final note before his death. I send empty ships to die. The Americans sink them full or empty. Our guns fall silent while theirs never stop. The Americans were not just outproducing Japan. They were weaponizing production itself. This disparity seeped into the next generation of fighters. Japanese pilots in 1941 received 700 flight hours and thousands of rounds of live gunnery training. By 1944, shortages meant new pilots fired only 30 rounds in total before their first combat mission. Ensign Koshi Ito, trained in late 1944, described it bitterly. I fired my guns 3 times in practice, 10 rounds each. The American I faced fired 30 in the first second. American pilots at Pensacola, by contrast, averaged 5,000 rounds during training alone, plus unlimited top-up for anyone who needed it. Skill, already valuable, became supercharged by opportunity. By the war's final year, the value of a single shell aboard a Japanese destroyer could be measured in lives. A wasted round might mean no defense during the next air attack. Gun captains had to account for every trigger pull, even during chaos. Commander Tameichi Hara, captured after his ship sank at Leyte, broke down when he saw a gunnery exercise aboard USS New Jersey. The battleship fired 400 rounds in training. I wept, he admitted later, not for shame of capture but because I finally understood. We never had a chance. He realized that for every Japanese battle fought in fear of scarcity, the Americans had fought with the certainty of surplus. This wasn't just logistics, it was a cultural divide born from production. American ships sailed with a rhythm: fight, replenish, fight again. The Japanese fought knowing that each battle might be their last, not just for men but for ammunition. This mindset shaped doctrine, strategy, and courage itself. One side could afford to be bold, the other was forced to be careful. And in modern war, bold usually beats careful. The Pacific War was not only fought in the air and on the sea. Its outcome was decided in the deafening silence of factories, where production lines ran day and night, turning steel and copper into power. By 1945, that power had become overwhelming. Between 1941 and 1945, the United States produced 47 billion rounds of ammunition, including over 41 billion small arms cartridges. Japan, across the entire war, produced an estimated 15 million rounds total. The ratio wasn't just large, it was 3,100 to 1. Every American destroyer gunnery exercise consumed more ammunition than a Japanese division might see in months of fighting. Every fleet operation was backed by a continent-sized industrial engine. Ammunition depots like Hastings and McAllister became cities unto themselves, employing tens of thousands, producing hundreds of thousands of shells each month. At Hastings alone, the daily output of 5-inch shells exceeded Japan's national production for many calibers. The workers who assembled those shells lived in dormitories, ate in company cafeterias, and bowled in on-site alleys. War was a process, not an emergency. Meanwhile, in Japan, the opposite story unfolded. Factories shrank as resources vanished. Copper shortages forced the melting of temple bells and household goods. Workers became schoolchildren, untrained and exhausted, handling explosives with trembling hands. At Toyokawa Naval Arsenal, accident rates soared to 15% monthly. In the final months, daily output sometimes fell to a few dozen shells. On August 14, 1945, the last production report from Kure Arsenal recorded 73 shells produced that day. 423 workers left, many of them students. Critical shortages in every category. That same day, Hastings Naval Depot in Nebraska reported 45,000 shells produced. 5,800 workers on shift. Surplus stock above requirements. That comparison was more devastating than any battlefield loss. Japan had run out of numbers before it ran out of courage. The American military didn't fight alone. It fought with a civilian army of machinists, assemblers, technicians, and inspectors. Every factory was a weapon, every shipping line a vein of steel. In the words of Admiral Ernest King, "Our fleet does not run out of ammunition, it only runs out of targets." This wasn't arrogance, it was arithmetic. The Japanese High Command once believed that superior tactics could offset industrial disadvantage. But war in the 20th century had changed. Firepower no longer belonged to the clever, it belonged to the abundant. For Japanese officers, the act of counting ammunition became a ritual of despair. They measured each battle in shells, not in miles gained or ships sunk. Lieutenant Ono described it simply. "We were fighting with our last rounds every time." Captain Hara once said they brought swords to a machine gun fight. By 1945, the machine gun had grown into an entire industrial civilization. America didn't just outproduce Japan. It produced so much that it could waste without consequence. Ammunition wasn't something to conserve. It was something to spend to make victory faster. Ensign Tio Matsui, manning a 25 mount on carrier Zuikaku, received only 10 rounds for the final battle of Cape Engano. He held his fire, waiting for a perfect moment that never came. Zuikaku went down with his ammunition still in the tray. His last letter to his mother read, "I have 10 chances to protect our ship. I will make each one count." That same day, Seaman Robert Dixon aboard USS Essex fired 15,000 rounds in one engagement. He wrote home, "Mom, you wouldn't believe how many bullets we shoot. It's like a fireworks show that never ends." Both young men were brave, but one counted bullets like gold. The other fired like the supply was endless. Historians often date the Pacific War from Pearl Harbor in 1941. But in truth, it was decided years earlier, when one nation built its factories for a global war and the other did not. When Emperor Hirohito announced surrender on August 15, 1945, he spoke of a new and most cruel bomb. But inside Japan's military leadership, they already knew. The atomic bomb had ended the war quickly, but the ammunition war had already ended it slowly. Admiral Somu Toyoda, the final commander of the Imperial Navy, admitted after the war, "We could build ships without steel, we could fly planes without fuel, but we could not fight without ammunition. The Americans had infinite amounts. We had what we could salvage from temples." The Pacific War's final truth lies not in the courage of those who fired, but in the capacity of those who made the shells. America could afford to fire without thinking. Japan could only afford to think without firing. In that difference lay an empire's defeat, not because its soldiers lacked bravery, but because its factories lacked output, not because its gunners missed, but because they ran out of shots long before the enemy did. The last casings now rest on the ocean floor, stamped with the insignia of a nation whose industry became its ultimate weapon. Wars between industrial powers, one strategist later wrote, are won before they begin, in the echo of assembly lines, not on the battlefield. The guns have long since fallen silent, but the arithmetic remains.